The amount of tears shed in the text is significant, especially on a day like today. Like every holiday, Mother's Day is an interesting day. It is sweet for some, and it is bitter for others. On a day like Mother's Day, there is this mixture in which, because of recollections of mothers who are present, there is a kind of sweetness, a kind of joy and celebratory in the atmosphere on a day like today. But for others, it's not so sweet. For some, today becomes a bitter day, a day of recounting, remembering loss, hurt, neglect, failure, abuse. For others, it's not just sweet, not just bitter. For some, it's bittersweet. It's an assimilation of both things. A day where it's filled with some joy, but also some sadness. And this is always the tension that a pastor feels when he has to stand on a day like Mother's Day and somehow applaud and celebrate those who are worthy of celebration because of their sacrifice, while not minimizing the suffering of others who sit in the same audience. On a day like Mother's Day, there are some women who have not been able to give birth, and as singles, they feel like outsiders on a day like today. They feel as if they have no place in the celebration because, after all, how can I celebrate? There are some women who have lost children through miscarriages, abortions. And there are days in which Mother's Day is so hurtful for them. How do you do both? How do you minister to those who have sacrificed and those who have suffered? How do you celebrate? How do you help them to understand? Well, I'm submitting to you that a part of it demands truth-telling, which is to say, we have to help people to understand that motherhood is not the greatest achievement for a woman. That motherhood is not somehow the most noble goal that a woman can ascend to. We have to find a way to recognize that a woman's greatest accomplishment is not in her ability to bear children, and her greatest failure is not in the absence of bearing children. That somehow motherhood must be properly positioned in a place where it becomes simply one of God's many tools that he uses to glorify himself, family, develop the community, but it's not the only tool. And there has to be a way in which we help people to recognize that God sometimes works through tears as a tool that reshapes, that reforms, and that somehow ultimately leads to his glory. We've got to find a way to help the person who's longing for a child to recognize that longing, that unfulfilled desire can be used by God to draw you closer to himself. And we've got to help those who have lost a child to realize that God can use longing and God can use loss. And in fact, if you have children, God can use the children you have to help conform you to the image of Christ, because nobody can make you cry like your kids. I realize there might be some who disagree, but the truth is that there is no greater pain than to have to deal with somebody who you gave life to, who disrespects, abuses, will not submit. There's no sharper tear that a parent, a mother or father can cry than a child who simply will not obey them. And sometimes God will use the longing for a child. Sometimes God will use the loss of a child. And sometimes God will use the kids you got to shape you into the image of Jesus. And motherhood is only one tool that God uses to shape us. So somebody will say, well, I heard you say that children are a blessing from the Lord. Yes, but the truth is, children are a blessing from the Lord, but because of the fall, not every mother will experience childbirth. Because in this life, there are some things that you desire that simply will not be fulfilled. You say, well, what is the fall, Reverend? Well, the fall is because God created us in this wonderful place called Eden, called paradise, where we shared its leadership as co-regents. Adam and Eve, husband and wife. But something happened. We went through the fall. And because of the fall, now all that was once possible is not possible on this side. On this side, because of the fall, you never see all of the colors that exist. You think you see red, green, and blue, but the truth is you've never seen red, green, and blue. Because your eyesight is so dimmed as a result of going through the fall, you're going to have to wait until heaven to see what colors really look like. You think you've heard all of the sounds in the world that are around you, but even now you are dulled in your hearing and can only hear a small percentage of the sounds because having gone through the fall, you don't hear all the sounds in the world. You're going to have to wait to get to heaven so that you can hear everything that needs to be heard. And right now, because of the fall, all of us women will not experience the act of childbearing. It's not possible. So how do we live? I think we take a page out of Hannah's book, because we try to understand something about what it means to live in a way where you are unfulfilled and recognize that that unfulfilled desire is sometimes God's tool to bring you into something greater than the desire called himself. That sometimes God will use your unfulfilled desire to bring you into something greater than what you desired, which is himself. And sometimes God will use a kind of traumatic experience to do it. The text says that Hannah is praying. The text says that Hannah has been crying. Inside verses 5, and though he loved Hannah, he would give her only one choice portion because the Lord had given her no children. I want you to be clear that as you read this, God has engineered a social tragedy. Because for a woman not to be able to give birth in the ancient world was humiliating. It was to leave her open to ridicule. It was debilitating, not just physically, but emotionally. And please understand who's doing this. The text says that it's God who has shut Hannah's womb. It's the same God who in the Genesis account said, be fruitful and multiply. And now the same God who said, be fruitful and multiply is the same God who's made a decision to shut Hannah's womb. Sometimes when we talk about God in the biblical narrative, I'm amazed at the way we somehow domesticate him. But the truth is that this God is sometimes scary and sometimes hard to understand. I didn't say he was ever unjust or unfair, but there are times when it's hard to get your mind around God. How in the world would you be the one who says be fruitful and multiply, and now at the same time be responsible for closing the womb so that I cannot give birth? And yet the text is clear that it is this God who does this God who will sometimes engineer a social and natural tragedy in order to show you a triumph that's greater than the thing you were anticipating, which is himself. It is this God who sometimes has a purpose that's greater than whatever it is we personally desire, and he orchestrates, navigates, engineers pain and suffering to show us something we could not see apart from having gone through that experience. It's why every now and then you want to be careful that as you claim the promises of God, you don't lose sight of the fact that he still has a purpose. And even though he can grant the promise, you still have to make your way to his ultimate purpose. You're looking at me funny. I want to make sure you can understand this. Joshua goes into the promised land as a fulfillment of the promise. But when he gets to the promised land, there are still giants that have to be fought. Because in the midst of experiencing God's promise, the purpose of God has not yet been completed. Which means even though God fulfills a promise, you still might have to cry sometimes. I know you don't understand that, but wait until God gives you the woman that you want and you marry for more than 5 minutes and you might cry. Wait until God gives you the man you long for and you've been married longer than 30 seconds and having fulfilled the promise, you still might cry. Wait until God gives you the son or the daughter that you desire, and one day around 5 years old, 10 years old, 20 years old, 30 years old, they might make you cry because the fulfillment of the promise is not the end of purpose. And all of those negative accidents, circumstances, situations, he sends them to achieve his purpose, which is making you look more like Jesus. That's why you can't develop a theology of I want what I want. One, you don't know what you want. And God will give you what you need. It's why you can't look at every trial and not realize that God wants to transform the trial and your tears, but you still got to go through the trial because you haven't been built to live for yourself. You've been built to live for his glory. So sometimes he denies a desire. Sometimes he creates loss. Sometimes he sends pain to help you become what you and I need to become. Am I making sense to anybody? It is this God that creates this paradox. In fact, you read it in John chapter 9 in Jesus' narrative, the gospel. There was a guy who was blind. And they ran up on Jesus and said, hey, look, he's blind. Who sinned, him or his parents? And the Lord said, nobody. This was done so that the power of God might be seen. And Hannah, to her credit, has come to the place where the power of God can be realized and experienced. You see, God ends up rewarding her faith. But here's the incredible thing about Hannah. You see, it is God who has shut her womb. And yet Hannah turns to that God in the midst of her pain. She's not like Sarah. She doesn't scheme and say, why not take Hagar? Hannah, in her pain, runs to the place where she knows she can get what she needs. And she turns to God, not to some kind of scheme to get what she wants. And she's to be revered and admired because she understands, having now recognized this as a tool of God to make her into something she could never be, that she must run to the one who alone can satisfy. Man or woman, if you're listening today, hear me well. There are some things you need that can't no person ever satisfy. My sister, don't look for a man to fulfill you. My brother, don't look for a woman to fulfill you, because you've got some needs so deep that no man could ever fulfill those needs. I don't care what he thinks he is. At a base level, what you need is another man whose name is Jesus. And your man is my man, because he can satisfy in ways that nobody else can. She turns to him, and the incredible thing is that God is in the process of helping her pass her tears and her taunts, because Peninnah is one of those kind of sisters who every time Hannah goes to the church to worship, Peninnah is there taunting her. In fact, Peninnah acts like Cookie. All due respect to Taraji P, but everybody knows somebody like Cookie, who no matter what you do, she's coming at you. And can you imagine what it would have been like? You see, you would have expected if Hannah had been in the 21st century and Cookie rolled up on her in church, there'd have been a fight in church. Don't act like you never heard of this. They shooting each other in church now. I mean, this is, to Hannah's credit, her recognition that in light of the ridicule and the humiliation as a woman not giving birth and the kind of taunting she must endure, she now turns to God. Let me tell you something. Have you ever found your foundation being rocked and then prayed to God only to find out that it was God who was rocking the foundation? She turns to the same God in a manner of faith, and God models and demonstrates through Hannah something that maybe we should all learn. Hannah is socially an outcast, powerless. But one thing I like about Hannah, she teaches us that real power is not in your position in society. Hannah teaches us that real power is in your posture before God. You see, you got to understand the power differential when you feel powerless. And sometimes those who seem like they're powerless are really in power. If you don't believe me, you grab that 4'11" waitress that you like to yell at when you go to eat out and give such a hard time. And I know when you're sitting there with the power to give her your little $2 tip, you think you got the power. That's why you're fussing at her about the way the food is not been prepared. But when that little 4'11" waitress goes behind them closed doors, I want you to know there's a power differential. It shifts. And I know why you thought you was in power. When she goes behind them closed doors, somebody else is in power. That's why you better be careful how you treat those who appear to be powerless. Because at the end of the day, you just might get a little extra something sprinkled on that meal. You might just get an additional flavoring that you know nothing about, because the one who seems powerless is really in the power's seat. And Hannah seems to be powerless, but the truth is she understands that true power is not located in my position in the society. Power is located in my posture before the Lord. And so she goes to God with her tears, and God transforms her tears. In fact, this is the first place in the Old Testament narrative in which a person praying uses the term Lord of Heaven's armies. That's what she says as she prays. Because, you see, real pain can transform your theology. You see, how you see God is based on your experience of God. Come on, say it with me for a minute. It's called contextualization. It's called social location. It's called understanding God on the basis of where you are. Nobody understands God in some sort of vacuum. The only way you come to know God is through your experience with God. You cannot know God in an abstract way. The only way you get to know God is that God reveals himself in a particular situation, in a social location. He reveals himself, and then you come to know God because you've experienced God in a particular way. You can't know God as a healer if you've never been sick. You can't know God as a deliverer if you've never been bound. You can't know that God makes a way if you've never been stuck. But once you find him to be healer, once you found him to be deliverer, once you found him to be sight and light and make a way for you, now you experience God for who he is in your experience. That's why show me somebody that can't testify about something the Lord has done. I'll show you somebody who doesn't really know God. Because when you know who he is and you know what is done, you can tell somebody about what the Lord has done for you. Do I have a witness anywhere? You know he made a way out of nowhere. You know he can make possible the impossible. You know he took you when you were down and raised you up. And when somebody steps to you and tries to act like they gonna tell you about your God, you shut them down and say, no, let me tell you what he's done for me. I was crying, but he dried my tears. I was depressed, but it brought me out. I know something about him. I know who he is. Not talking about an abstract deity, but a God who deposits himself in the situation of her tears. And the truth is that her faith, in spite of her infertility, or because of her infertility, I don't know which one it is. Some people have faith in spite of. Some people have faith because of. Some people grew in their depth and their understanding of who God is because of what they went through. And some have preserved their faith in spite of what they've went through. Hannah, for whatever reason, has understood that there's a place where I need to go. And she comes to God as Lord of heaven's armies. That's why I said what you go through will change your theology. Because she understood that, wait a minute, I got a problem, but you know what? You got an army. And what's going on in my life is not greater than who you are. And she understands something about this God who is so vast and so powerful that he can turn around. Eli finds her in the place of worship, in the house of worship, and she is weeping profusely. In fact, this phrase for pain is actually in the Hebrew a kind of pain that can never be relieved by human beings. It's the kind of guttural, primordial hurt that only God can heal. It's the ache, not of the physical body. It's the ache of the soul. And she's weeping. And God has paid attention to her tears. It's fortunate that God is paying attention to her tears because Eli the priest is missing it. You see, every man of God is still just a man. You can keep throwing money at the altar if you want to. But every man of God is still just a man. And Eli is a man of God, but he's missing something. He can read lips, but he can't read her heart. And to him, she appears to be just drunk. Hannah is tapped into someone else. And when Eli comes on the scene, he mistakenly assumes something that is not true. He assumes that she's drunk, when in truth, she's just hurt. And no matter who the man is, there are some things he can't see. Only God can. That's why, ladies, you need him. Because there's some hurts only he can see, and only some hurts he can heal. And that's not just good for ladies. That's good for every brother in the house. But because God sees, Eli is able to recognize, step back, and simply say these words, in that case, go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant the request you have asked of him. And oh, thank you, sir, she exclaimed when she went back and began to eat again, and she was no longer sad. Verse 19, the entire family got up early the next morning and went to worship the Lord once more. And here's what I'd like you to see. Sometimes it's easy for us to shout and have a good time in the Lord when we go to worship and we get something. But they get up the next day when a vow has been made, a commitment has been made, and it's not simply the getting of something. She is going to worship God clear in her mind that one day she's going to have to give something up. The most fascinating thing about both of them, Elkanah and Hannah, is that this chapter 1 of Samuel takes place in the context of the days of the judges, when the Bible says each man did that which was right in his own eyes, and there was no king in Israel. So in the midst of chaos, in the midst of corruption, in the midst of confusion, these people are still going up on a yearly basis to do what? To worship. No matter what's going on around her, they are still committed to the sovereign God and the worship of that God in a community, in a context where ain't nobody giving God glory. In a context where nobody is concerned about God at all. Everybody is doing that which is right in their own eyes. They have maintained the posture of coming to the Lord in a consistent and ritual-like manner and worship God no matter what's going on around them. Do you know that takes some kind of faith? That takes some kind of life to keep coming and worshiping God and loving the Lord no matter what's happening. And in fact, they kept coming even though Peninnah was meeting her there. And I know way too many people who drop right out of church because they don't like somebody. Somebody didn't speak to me. Somebody didn't look at me. Somebody didn't acknowledge me. Somebody walked right by me. Well, if you had to deal with Cookie, would you still keep coming? And yet they kept coming. She kept coming every year to worship and to sacrifice to the God who she knew no matter what Peninnah was doing. And that's the way God begins the process of transformation. He gets you away from the taunting. He gets you to understand his tools. He gets you to see the truth. And then he transforms all of those tears by making you somebody you could never be in the midst of your tragedy. Worship, not because I'm getting something, but when you bless me, I'm bringing him back here and I'm going to give him up to you. It reminds me of another mother and father who also had to sacrifice their son. His name was Jesus. Their names Mary and Joseph. And a few hundred years later, they'll come to the tabernacle as well, dedicate Jesus, and know that one day he's going to hang on a cross. But the good news is that God can transform the tears, and his son has done that for us. You say, why is that? Because Hannah came into church crying. But when you look at the text, when she went out of church, she was rejoicing. And that's what I like about God. You can come in one way, but you can go out another way. You can come in wondering how you're going to pay bills, how you're going to handle them youngins, how you're going to deal with that Negro, Anglo, Latino at home. You can come in wondering about how you're going to pay for college. You can come in wondering about where you're going to get a job. You can come in wondering about how you're going to eat. But you can walk out this door knowing that he'll supply every need, knowing that no weapon formed against you shall prosper. You can go out of here knowing that if the Lord will make a way somehow, you'll go out of here knowing that if he never does another thing for me, he's done enough already. You can go out with your mind right and your heart fixed and go out with your hands raised up. You came in crying, but you go out rejoicing because God can transform your tears. Is there anybody here that says, I know you're right? I know he can change you. I came in one way, kind of tired, hadn't had enough sleep, but then all of a sudden they got to singing and they got to talking, and I started to sense that the presence of the Lord is here. And I came in sad, but I'm going out glad. I came in mad, but I said, Lord, now I see you, and I'll worship you no matter what. I came in one way, but I'm going out another way because God can transform. Have you ever been transformed? Is there anybody here that can say, I know you're right? He picked me up. He turned me around. He gave me strength when I was weak, clarity when I was confused. Thanks be to God who transforms. I'm so glad that another son decided to transform my life. I was sinking deep in sin, far from the peaceful shore, very deeply stained within, sinking to rise no more. But the master of the sea heard my despairing cry, and from the waters He lifted me, and now safe, sane, satisfied, stabilized, secure am I. It was Jesus that has transformed and made the difference in our lives.